A German pilot stands on the tarmac at Wright Field, Ohio. The year is 1945. The aircraft in front of him is a North American P-51 Mustang, perhaps the most feared fighter in the American arsenal. This same aircraft type has been destroying his countrymen for months. It has escorted bombers that reduced German cities to rubble. It has shot his friends out of the sky. And now he is about to climb into the cockpit, not as a prisoner, not under duress. He asked for this. His name was Hans-Werner Lerche, and for 33 years, almost everything about what happened next remained locked in classified files. The story challenges our assumptions about enemies and allies, about duty and conscience, about what happens when professional respect collides with the brutality of war. This is not a simple tale of betrayal. It is something far more complicated. Let me take you back to where it began. December 1944. The Third Reich is dying, though not everyone knows it yet. Hitler has thrown his remaining forces into the Ardennes forest in a desperate attempt to split the Allied lines. History will remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. It will fail. But consider what Germany looked like in those final months. Cities that had stood for centuries were now collections of broken walls and burning timber. The Allied bombing campaign had become relentless, waves of aircraft appearing overhead day and night. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which had once darkened the skies over Poland, France, and Britain, was hemorrhaging pilots faster than it could train replacements. Fuel was rationed so severely that new pilots sometimes went into combat with fewer than a dozen hours of flight time. Many did not survive their first engagement. And yet, among the dwindling ranks of German aviators, there were still men of extraordinary ability. Veterans who had been flying combat missions since the invasion of Poland in 1939. Aces who had survived through some combination of skill, experience, and luck, when so many others had not. Hans-Werner Lerche was one of these men. Born in 1914, Lerche had joined the German aviation program in the early 1930s, during those shadowy years when Germany was secretly rebuilding its air power in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. By the time war broke out, he had already established himself as one of the Luftwaffe's most capable test pilots. Think about what that meant. A test pilot does not simply fly aircraft. He takes experimental machines into the sky, pushes them to their limits, documents their capabilities and failures, and somehow survives long enough to report back. It requires a particular combination of technical knowledge, physical skill, and calm under pressure that few possess. By late 1944, Lerche had tested virtually every significant aircraft in the German inventory. He had flown the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of German fighter operations since the Spanish Civil War. He had evaluated the Focke-Wulf 190, considered by many to be the finest piston-engine fighter Germany ever produced. Most significantly, he had test-flown the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, an aircraft that terrified Allied pilots when it appeared in the skies over Europe. He knew German aviation secrets that entire intelligence divisions were desperate to uncover. And on December 14, 1944, everything changed. The details of what happened that morning remain partially obscured even today. What we know is this: Lerche was conducting a test flight in a Messerschmitt Bf 109, evaluating modifications to the aircraft's performance characteristics. This was routine work, the kind of mission he had flown dozens of times before. Then his engine failed. Imagine that moment. You are thousands of feet above the ground in a single-engine aircraft. The power plant that keeps you aloft has gone silent. Below you, the landscape is a patchwork of territory controlled by opposing armies. You have seconds to make decisions that will determine whether you live or die. What caused the engine failure? There are several theories. By late 1944, German factories were increasingly staffed by forced laborers, prisoners from concentration camps and occupied territories who had every reason to sabotage the war equipment they were being forced to produce. Critical engine components were being manufactured from inferior materials as Germany's access to quality metals diminished. Aircraft that would have been grounded for maintenance in 1940 were being pushed back into service out of desperation. Any of these factors could have killed Lerche's engine that morning. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Lerche had options. He could have attempted to glide back toward German-held territory. He could have bilayed out and hoped to land among friendly forces. He could have tried a crash landing in a field where German soldiers might reach him first. He chose none of these. Instead, Hans-Werner Lerche guided his failing aircraft toward American lines and put it down in enemy territory. Why? The official explanation, the one Lerche himself offered in later years, was concern for civilian safety. An emergency landing in a German town might have killed innocent people. The Americans, he reasoned, would at least follow the rules of war regarding prisoners. But was that the whole truth? We will return to that question. For now, consider what the Americans found when they reached the crash site. They discovered a German aircraft in remarkably good condition, the kind of intact enemy machine that intelligence officers dreamed about. And in the cockpit, alive and uninjured, sat one of the Luftwaffe's most valuable pilots. Standard procedure was clear. Enemy aviators were to be questioned by military intelligence, then transported to prisoner-of-war camps in the American interior. The interrogation typically lasted a few days, perhaps a week for a particularly knowledgeable prisoner. But when the intelligence officers realized exactly who they had captured, standard procedure went out the window. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson was the man who changed everything. Watson was himself a test pilot, one of America's most experienced. Since 1943, he had been stationed at Wright Field, evaluating captured German aircraft, trying to understand how enemy aviation technology compared to American designs. He had studied German planes in detail, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, forming theories about the thinking behind their construction. And now, sitting across a table from him, was perhaps the only man alive who could confirm or refute every one of those theories. The initial interrogation was scheduled for 72 hours. It lasted 3 weeks. Watson would later describe those sessions as among the most remarkable conversations of his military career. Here was a German pilot who could explain not merely how German aircraft performed, but the philosophy behind their design. He understood the trade-offs German engineers had made, the problems they were trying to solve, the constraints under which they operated. Every question led to more questions. Every answer revealed new avenues of inquiry. And somewhere during those 3 weeks, Watson began to conceive an idea that would have seemed insane just months earlier. What if, instead of simply asking Lerche about German aircraft, they allowed him to evaluate American planes? Picture the reaction when Watson first proposed this to his superiors. An enemy pilot, a man who had been trying to kill American airmen just weeks before, given access to classified American aircraft designs. The security implications were staggering. The political risks were enormous. If anything went wrong, careers would end. Courts-martial would follow. The answer was predictable and immediate. Absolutely not. But Watson persisted. He argued that Lerche represented a unique opportunity. Here was a man who had flown against American aircraft in combat, who understood German tactics and doctrine, who could evaluate American designs from a perspective no American pilot could provide. The intelligence value was incalculable. The debate escalated through the chain of command. Colonels argued with generals. Memos flew back and forth between Wright Field and Washington. Security officers raised objections. Intelligence officers countered them. 23 days after Watson first proposed the idea, a classified authorization arrived from the Pentagon. They were going to do it. The conditions were extraordinary, unlike anything the military had attempted before. Lerche would remain technically a prisoner of war, but his treatment would be far from typical. Instead of a barbed wire compound, he would be housed in comfortable quarters at Wright Field. He would have access to certain American aircraft, specifically those types that German pilots had already encountered in combat. Nothing experimental, nothing that would compromise future operations. Every flight would be monitored. Armed guards would watch from the ground. The aircraft themselves would be modified with fuel limitations and other measures to prevent any attempt at escape. But the most important condition was this. Lerche had to agree voluntarily. There could be no coercion, no threats, no false promises. If he refused, he would simply be treated like any other prisoner of war and shipped to a camp. When Watson presented the offer, Lerche sat in silence for a long time. Think about the weight of that moment. He was being asked to actively assist the nation that was destroying his homeland. Germany had not yet surrendered. The war continued. Men he knew, men he had trained with and flown beside, were still fighting and dying. And yet the war's outcome was no longer truly in doubt. The only questions remaining were how long the dying would continue and how many more would fall before the end. Lerche was also, above all else, an aviator. Here was a chance to fly aircraft he had only seen in combat, to experience American engineering from the inside rather than trying to shoot it down. For a man who had devoted his life to understanding flight, it was an extraordinary temptation. When he finally spoke, his response surprised everyone. He said he had conditions of his own. Consider the audacity of this. A prisoner of war, his country losing, his leverage essentially non-existent, making demands of his captors. His terms were simple but revealing. First, he would not participate in any mission that might directly harm German forces still in the field. Second, his evaluations would be honest and professional, regardless of what the Americans wanted to hear. Third, when the war ended, he wanted assistance immigrating to the United States. The Pentagon debated. There were those who found the entire arrangement distasteful, who argued that no matter how valuable the intelligence, there were principles at stake. There were others who insisted that winning the war as quickly as possible and understanding how to win future conflicts took precedence over abstract concerns about propriety. In the end, the pragmatists won. March 15, 1945, Wright Field, Ohio. Hans-Werner Lerche walked across the tarmac toward a P-51 Mustang. The irony was lost on no one present. The Mustang had been designed specifically to escort American bombers deep into German territory, to protect them from fighters like the ones Lerche had spent years testing. More than any other aircraft, the P-51 had broken the back of the Luftwaffe. It had shot down thousands of German planes and killed hundreds of German pilots. And now, a German test pilot was about to evaluate the weapon that had helped defeat his air force. For Lerche, the experience began before he even entered the cockpit. He watched the American ground crews preparing the aircraft. In Germany, by late 1944, maintenance had become increasingly haphazard. Parts shortages meant that aircraft flew with worn components that should have been replaced. Undertrained mechanics made mistakes that cost pilots their lives. The desperation of the war effort meant that corners were cut everywhere. Here, he saw something different. The American ground crews were meticulous and professional. Their equipment was clean and well-maintained. They worked with the confidence of men who had everything they needed to do their jobs properly. That alone told him something profound about why Germany was losing. His first flight in the Mustang lasted 2 hours. When he climbed out of the cockpit, American test pilots gathered around him, eager for his assessment. Lerche had never been one for diplomatic evasions. His response was characteristically direct. "Your engineers," he told them, "have solved problems we did not even know we had." Over the following weeks, Lerche would test fly virtually every front-line American fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive aircraft that German pilots had nicknamed the Jug for its heavy, barrel-shaped fuselage. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design. Even early versions of the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. Each flight was monitored. Each evaluation was recorded and classified. What Lerche revealed stunned the American pilots who debriefed him. When evaluating the P-47, he immediately identified why German pilots had struggled against it in combat. German fighters, he explained, were designed for short-range interception. They were built to scramble quickly, engage enemy aircraft over German territory, and return to base. German tacticians had assumed that American pilots would fight the same way. But the Americans had built aircraft for endurance. Their planes could fly long missions deep into enemy territory, stay and fight, and still have fuel to return home. German pilots, forced to break off engagements when their fuel ran low, found themselves constantly at a disadvantage. "We designed fighters to defend the Reich," Lerche told Watson. "You designed fighters to destroy it." That difference in philosophy proved decisive. But Lerche's most significant observation was not about any individual aircraft. It was about American industrial capability. "You do not just build better aircraft," he told Watson after a month of test flights. "You build aircraft better." What did he mean? In German factories, by the war's final years, quality varied enormously. Two aircraft of the same type, coming off the same production line, might perform quite differently. Components manufactured in one facility did not always fit properly with components from another. The inconsistency cost lives. American aircraft, by contrast, were standardized with remarkable precision. Every P-51 performed essentially like every other P-51. Every replacement part fit exactly as it should. The logistics of maintaining a massive air force became manageable in a way that Germany could never match. This, Lerche concluded, was why America was winning the war. Not just superior aircraft designs, though those mattered. Not just more aircraft, though those mattered too. What decided the conflict was the ability to produce quality consistently, at enormous scale, month after month and year after year. Germany had brilliant engineers. It had brave pilots. It had, in some cases, more advanced technology. What it lacked was the industrial depth to translate those advantages into victory. For the American pilots at Wright Field, Lerche's evaluations were revelatory. They had always known their aircraft were good. Now they understood precisely why, and precisely how their enemies had experienced that quality from the other side of gun sights. But something else was happening at Wright Field, something that no security protocol had anticipated. Relationships were forming. Watson had expected to deal with a Nazi ideologue. Instead, he found himself working with a consummate professional who approached every flight with the same dedication Watson tried to bring to his own work. The American pilots, who had initially viewed Lerche with suspicion and hostility, began to recognize a kindred spirit. These were men who lived for aviation, who shared a language and a passion that transcended national boundaries. As they worked together day after day, professional respect began to develop into something approaching friendship. For Lerche, the experience was equally transformative. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, technically inferior. They were presented as materialistic dilettantes who lacked the warrior spirit of German soldiers. The men Lerche worked with at Wright Field demolished those stereotypes. The pilots were skilled and dedicated. The engineers were brilliant. The entire operation ran with a precision and efficiency that put German efforts to shame. I had been told that Americans were inferior, Lerche later wrote. Everything I saw at Wright Field proved the opposite. It was a humbling experience, but also a liberating one. Watson became more than a colleague. The two men spent hours discussing not just aircraft performance, but the philosophy of flight testing, the future of aviation, their hopes for the world after the war ended. They discovered that they agreed on more than they disagreed on. Both believed that aviation would transform the post-war world. Both saw themselves as professionals whose primary loyalty was to their craft. Both hoped that the slaughter would end soon. On May 8, 1945, it did. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But for Lerche, the complications were just beginning. He was no longer an enemy prisoner, but he was not exactly free either. Germany was occupied and divided. Its aviation industry had been completely dismantled. There was no home to return to, not in any meaningful sense. And the Americans had a problem of their own. The war with Germany had ended, but a new conflict was already emerging. American military planners were beginning to view the Soviet Union as a future adversary. They were thinking about the next war even as the current one concluded. Lerche, they realized, had become even more valuable than before. He had flown against Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. He understood Russian aviation developments. Most importantly, he had proven himself trustworthy and professional, so they made him an offer. Would he consider a permanent position as a civilian test pilot with the United States Air Force? The offer would have seemed impossible just months earlier. A German, a former enemy, given access to America's most sensitive aviation facilities, working alongside pilots who had lost friends and comrades to German guns. There was opposition. Some American pilots questioned whether a former adversary could be trusted with such responsibilities. Old hatreds did not disappear simply because documents were signed. But Watson and others who had worked closely with Lerche argued passionately for the appointment. "This man has skills we need," Watson wrote in his recommendation. "More than that, he has demonstrated his integrity through his actions. We would be foolish to let him go." In December 1945, exactly 1 year after his capture, Hans-Werner Lerche was offered a contract as a civilian test pilot with the United States Air Force. He accepted immediately. Now let me tell you something that complicates this entire narrative. Remember the question of why Lerche's engine failed that December morning in 1944? I mentioned various theories: sabotage by forced laborers, poor quality materials, the general deterioration of German manufacturing. Declassified documents from the late 1970s suggest a different explanation. There is evidence, fragmentary but compelling, that Lerche may have sabotaged his own aircraft. Think about what that would mean. If the engine failure was deliberate, then everything that followed was not the result of chance. It was planned. The capture, the interrogation, the extraordinary opportunity to fly American aircraft, all of it was orchestrated by a German pilot who had decided, at some point before that December morning, that he wanted out. The documents do not provide definitive proof. Lerche himself never publicly confirmed or denied the theory before his death in 1997. But certain details in the maintenance records, certain inconsistencies in the official account, suggest that the engine failure was no accident. If this is true, it changes how we understand the entire story. Lerche would not be a prisoner who made the best of a bad situation. He would be a man who deliberately chose to defect, who used his technical knowledge to create the appearance of an accident, who calculated that his skills would be valuable enough to the Americans that they would not simply throw him in a camp. It would mean that his cooperation was not extracted through persuasion or opportunity. It was his goal from the beginning. Why would a decorated German officer, a man who had served his country for over a decade, make such a choice? The answer may lie in what Lerche saw during those final months of the war. By late 1944, it was clear to anyone with intelligence and access to information that Germany was going to lose. The only question was how much more destruction would occur before the end. Perhaps Lerche decided he wanted to survive that destruction. Perhaps he saw an opportunity to continue his life's work, flying experimental aircraft, even if it meant doing so for a former enemy. Perhaps he had simply had enough of watching young pilots die in machines that could no longer be properly maintained. We will never know for certain what was in his mind. But the possibility that Lerche planned his capture adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated story. Hans-Werner Lerche worked for the United States Air Force until 1950. His contributions during those 5 years helped shape American aviation development during the critical early years of the Cold War. The intelligence he provided about German aircraft technology informed American designs for years afterward. His insights into combat tactics were incorporated into training programs that prepared American pilots for the conflicts they would face in Korea and Vietnam. His evaluations helped the American military understand not just what they had built, but why it worked. Lerche's program was not an isolated experiment. It was connected to a larger operation called Paperclip, the American effort to recruit German scientists and engineers for the post-war world. Paperclip is often remembered for its most controversial figures, men like Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who helped develop the V-2 weapon and later built the rockets that carried American astronauts to the moon. But aviation specialists like Lerche were arguably just as significant, even if their contributions received less public attention. In 1950, Lerche returned to Germany to help rebuild that nation's aviation industry. The country that had tried to conquer Europe was now a divided nation struggling to find its place in the post-war order. The aviation expertise that had once built weapons of war was now needed for civilian purposes. Lerche continued working as a test pilot and aviation consultant into the 1970s. He flew aircraft from both sides of the Iron Curtain, maintaining professional relationships that spanned the Cold War divide. He became something of a legend in aviation circles, a man whose career had taken him from the cockpit of Germany's most secret weapons to the heart of American aviation development and back again. Watson remained friends with Lerche for the rest of the German pilot's life. They corresponded regularly, met when circumstances allowed, maintained a connection that had begun in an interrogation room and evolved into something neither had expected. Hans showed me that professional competence and personal integrity can transcend national boundaries, Watson wrote years later. Even in the middle of the most destructive war in human history, it was possible for former enemies to find common ground. Lerche died in 1997, more than half a century after that December morning when his engine failed over enemy territory. He was remembered in aviation museums on both sides of the Atlantic. In Germany, he was honored as one of the great test pilots of the 20th century. In the United States, he was remembered as a valuable contributor to American aviation during a critical period. So what do we make of this story? Was Lerche a traitor? He actively assisted the war effort of a nation that was destroying his homeland. He shared secrets that may have cost German lives. He chose personal survival over national loyalty. Or was he a pragmatist? A man who recognized that the war was lost and decided to salvage what he could from the wreckage. A professional whose primary loyalty was to his craft rather than to any particular flag. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps human beings are too complex to fit into simple categories of hero and villain, patriot and traitor. Consider what both sides gained from the arrangement. The Americans received invaluable intelligence about German aviation technology and tactics. But they also gained something less tangible, a perspective on their own capabilities that only an enemy could provide. Lerche showed them their strengths in ways they had never fully understood. Lerche gained survival, certainly. He escaped the final catastrophe of the Third Reich. He built a new career in the post-war world. He continued doing what he loved, testing aircraft and advancing the science of flight, rather than wasting away in a prisoner of war camp. But he also gained something else. He discovered that the enemies he had been trained to hate were not monsters. They were professionals like himself, men who shared his passion for aviation and his dedication to excellence. That discovery changed him. The classified files on Hans-Werner Lerche were not fully declassified until 1978. For 33 years, one of the most remarkable prisoner of war stories of the Second World War remained hidden in military archives. Why the secrecy? Partly because the technical intelligence Lerche provided remained operationally significant for decades, but partly because the story challenged comfortable narratives about the war. We prefer our history simple: good against evil, us against them. The truth is usually more complicated. Lerche's story reminds us that real human beings rarely fit neatly into the categories we create for them. That professional respect can develop between people who are supposed to be mortal enemies. That individual choices made in moments of crisis can create connections that outlast the conflicts that brought them together. In a world that often seems divided by insurmountable differences, that may be the most important lesson of all. If you found yourself in Lerche's position, what would you do? Your country is losing a war. Your enemies offer you a chance to survive, to use your skills to build a new life. But accepting means betraying everything you once swore to defend. There is no easy answer. That is precisely the point. History is full of people who faced impossible choices and made decisions that cannot be easily judged. Understanding their stories requires us to set aside our assumptions and consider what we might have done in their place. Hans-Werner Lerche made his choice that December morning in 1944. Whether his engine failed by accident or by design, everything that followed was shaped by that moment. A German pilot became an American asset. An enemy became a colleague. A prisoner became, in his own way, free. The skies above Europe have been peaceful for decades now. The nations that once tried to destroy each other are now allies. Young pilots from Germany and America train together, fly together, build friendships that would have been unimaginable in 1944. Perhaps that transformation, more than any technical intelligence, is Hans-Werner Lerche's true legacy. He demonstrated that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, professional respect and simple decency can survive. The story of what he discovered at Wright Field, and what his American colleagues learned from him, helped shape the world we live in today. Some stories stay classified because they contain dangerous secrets. Others stay hidden because they contain dangerous truths, truths that complicate the narratives we tell ourselves about who we are and who our enemies were. This was one of those stories. Now you know it too.